friends, it's your teen and tween librarian Rebecca, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. First things first, before we get started into the story, and I'm really raring to go because I'm getting excited about where they're going, I have to make some updates. I have been pronouncing a large number of these Icelandic words incorrectly. I found this out myself because there was a word coming up that I had no idea how to pronounce. I have taken German over the years in college and things, so I know how to pronounce those words. And I mistakenly assumed that Icelandic was similar. It is not. It is very different. For example, tonight I want to share with you the mountain that we are exploring. It is an actual mountain in Iceland. But although it is written Sneffels, as you can see here, Sneffels, that's how it's written in the book. It's actually spelled Snæfellsnes. That A-E kind of smushed together, have that I sound. And it's technically called Snæfellsnes, which I think actually sounds less silly. If you grew up on Sesame Street like I did, maybe you're constantly being reminded of Snuffleupagus. He's a much less scary mountain idea than Snæfellsnes. So I'm going to share with you some corrections as we go because I think language is so interesting, and the way that we all choose to speak and how that all develops is fascinating. So we're going to learn some Icelandic pronunciation as we go. But tonight we've learned Snæfellsnes, and although I know it's Snæfellsnes, I'm probably still going to pronounce it Sneffels just because that's the way it's written, and that's how I've been pronouncing it. So I'm worried if I try to change it now, it's just going to throw the whole thing into chaos. So that's what we learned today. Snæfellsnes is the mountain in Iceland. Let's get going with chapter 19. Enjoy. Chapter 19. Upwards again. The next day, the 30th of June, at 6 in the morning, we began the descent again. We were still following the lava gallery, a real natural ramp, as gently sloping as those inclined planes which can still be found in place of the staircase in some old houses. This went on until about 12:17, at which moment we came up with Hans, who had just stopped. "Ah!" exclaimed my uncle, "we have come to the end of the chimney." I looked around me. We were at the intersection of two roads, both of them dark and narrow. Which ought we to take? This was a difficult question to decide. My uncle, however, did not wish to appear to hesitate before either me or the guide. He pointed to the eastern tunnel, and soon all three of us were inside it. In any case, any hesitation before this choice of roads would have lasted indefinitely, for there was no indication to guide our choice. We had to trust entirely to chance. The slope of this new gallery was very slight, and its section extremely variable. Sometimes a succession of arches appear before us like the aisles of a Gothic cathedral. Here, the architects of the Middle Ages might have studied all the forms of that religious architecture which developed from the pointed arch. A mile farther on, we would have to bend our heads under low arches of the Romanesque type, resting on thick pillars half embedded in the walls. In some places, this arrangement gave place to low substructures, which looked like bearers' workings, and we had to crawl along through narrow tunnels. The temperature remained at a perfectly bearable level. I could not help thinking of what it must have been when the lava vomited by Sneffels had rushed along this route, now so quiet. I imagined the torrents of fire breaking against every corner in the gallery and the accumulation of the superheated gases in this confined space. I only hope, I thought, that old volcano doesn't take it into his head to start this sort of thing right now. I refrained from communicating these fears to Uncle Liedenbrock, who would not have understood. His one idea was to go on, and he walked, slid, and even tumbled with a determination which one could not help admiring. At 6 in the evening, after a fairly easy day's walk, we had gone 5 miles south, but barely a quarter of a mile in depth. My uncle called a halt for rest. We ate without much conversation and went to sleep without much reflection. Our arrangements for the night were very simple. A traveling rug each, in which we rolled ourselves, was our only bedding. We had no cause to fear either cold or intrusive visits. Travelers who plunge into the deserts of Africa or the forests of the New World are obliged to watch over each other during the night hours. But here, there was absolute solitude and complete safety, with no wild beasts or savages to fear. We awoke the next day fresh and in good spirits and resumed our journey, following the path of the lava as before. It was impossible to recognize the nature of the rocks through which it passed. The tunnel, instead of plunging downwards into the bowels of the earth, was tending to become horizontal, and even seemed to me to be rising slightly. About 10 in the morning, this rise became so marked and consequently so tiring that I was obliged to slow down. "What's the matter, Axel?" the professor asked impatiently. "I'm tired out," I replied. "What? After 3 hours' walk over such easy ground?" "It may be easy, but it's tiring all the same." "What, when we've nothing to do but go down?" "I beg your pardon, but you mean go up." "Up?" said my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. "Yes, up. The slope changed a half an hour ago, and if we keep on like this, we shall certainly return to the surface of Iceland." The professor shook his head with the air of a man who does not want to be convinced. I tried to continue the conversation, but he did not reply and gave the signal to go on. I saw that his silence was nothing but concentrated ill humor. However, I bravely shouldered my burden again and hurried after Hans, who was following my uncle. I was anxious to not be left behind, and my chief preoccupation was to not lose sight of my companions. I shuddered at the thought of losing my way in this maze. Besides, if the upward path was becoming increasingly tiring, I consoled myself with the thought that it was bringing me nearer to the surface. This was a hope which every step confirmed, and I rejoiced at the thought of seeing my little Gräuben again. At noon, a change occurred in the walls of the gallery. I noticed this by a decrease in the amount of light reflected by the sides. The coating of lava had given place to solid rock. Arranged in sloping and often vertical strata, we were passing through rocks of the transitional period, the Silurian period. "It's all quite clear," I exclaimed. "In the second period, the water deposits formed these schists, limestones, and shales. We are turning our backs on the granite mass. We are like the people from Hamburg taking over the Hanover Road to go to Lübeck." I ought to have kept these remarks to myself, but my geological temperament got the better of my prudence, and Uncle Liedenbrock heard my exclamations. "What is it?" he said. "Look," I replied, pointing to the succession of shales and limestones and the first signs of slate. "Well?" "We have come to the rocks of the period when the first plants and animals appeared." "Oh, do you think so?" "Have a good look yourself." I made the professor move his lamp over the walls of the gallery, expecting him to show some sign of surprise, but he did not say a word and simply walked on. Had he not understood me? Was he refusing out of avuncular or scientific vanity to admit that he had made a mistake in choosing the eastern tunnel? Or was he determined to explore this passage to the end? It was obvious that we had left the lava route, and that this path could not possibly lead to the furnace of Sneffels. All the same, I wondered whether I might not be attributing too much importance to this change in the rock, and making a mistake myself. Were we really choosing these layers of rock superimposed on the granite foundation? If I am right, I thought, I am bound to find some remains of primitive plants, and then there will be no denying the evidence of our eyes. I must keep my eyes skinned. I think he means like eyes peeled, but that's now making me think about the origin of either of those phrases. We'll just say eyes opened. I had not gone 100 yards before I found incontrovertible proof. This was scarcely surprising, for in the Silurian epoch, the seas contained over 1,500 vegetable and animal species. My feet, which had grown accustomed to the hard lava floor, suddenly began stirring up a dust composed of the debris of plants and shells. On the walls, there were distinct impressions of rockweeds and club mosses. Professor Liedenbrock must have recognized them, but he shut his eyes, I imagine, and pressed on at an unvarying pace. This was carrying stubbornness too far, and I could not stand it any longer. I picked up a perfectly preserved shell, which had belonged to an animal rather similar to the present-day woodlouse, and then catching up with my uncle, I said, "Look at this." "Well," he said calmly, "it's the shell of a crustacean of the extinct species of the trilobites, that's all." "But don't you conclude—" "What you conclude yourself? Yes, I do. We have left the granite mass and the lava root. I may have made a mistake, but I cannot be sure of that until we reach the end of this gallery." "That is the right course to adopt, Uncle, and I would approve wholeheartedly if we weren't threatened by an ever-increasing danger." "And what is that?" "A shortage of water." "Well, Axel, we must ration ourselves." And that's the end of chapter 19. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what's happening at the library by visiting us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always just go to the library's website. I hope to see you again for the next episode of Bedtime Stories, but until then, be well and sleep well.